The chandeliers wept light onto a sea of sharks. From the shadowed service corridor, that's all Annalise could see. Predators circling in tailored suits and glittering gowns, their laughter sharp as shattered glass. The scent of expensive perfume, seared steak, and something cold like old money bled through the doorway, a perfume of a world she served but could never enter. Her feet ached, a dull, familiar throb that sang in time with the pounding in her head. Just a few more hours. She hated these nights. She hated them because they were a cruel mirror, polishing her own invisibility to a high sheen. Here, she wasn't a person. She was a pair of hands, a ghost meant to refill a glass and disappear. Which meant she was safe. But then, her supervisor, a man with a damp handshake named Mr. Dubois, cornered her by the kitchens. "Annalise," he said, his voice a little too slick. "We're short-staffed on the main floor. I need you in the ballroom. Look sharp." Her thoughts spun into chaos. The main floor was a minefield of wandering hands and dismissive glares. "Sir, I normally work the perimeter." "Not tonight." He straightened his bow tie, his eyes lingering a moment too long. "Don't disappoint me." Deep down, she knew the truth. Arguing was pointless. It would only draw more attention. A defiant retort died on her lips as she nodded, her stomach twisting. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pushed through the swinging doors and into the lion's den. The weight of 1,000 eyes she imagined were on her, pressing down like a physical force. Her real focus, however, was miles away, in a quiet, sterile room where her younger sister Maya was fighting a battle far more terrifying than any society gala. The medical bill for Maya's last treatment sat on their tiny kitchen counter, a sheet of paper that held more power over her life than any man in this room. That was why she was here. It was always for Maya.
Meanwhile, across the opulent ballroom, a king stood dressed as a pawn. Alessio Volkov watched the spectacle from a shadowed alcove, the impeccably tailored suit he wore feeling like a cheap costume. As if he owned the very air she breathed, his presence was a void, a deliberate blank space in a room full of noise. No one saw him. No one knew the man whose name could make billionaires tremble was standing right beside them, judging them. His consigliere, Valerio, a man whose face was carved from granite and loyalty, stood beside him, his disapproval a silent, heavy cloak. "This is a fool's errand, Alessio," Valerio murmured, his voice a low rumble. "You are the head of the Volkov family. You do not need to play games. If you want to know who is loyal, you test them with a blade, not a champagne flute." Alessio's dark eyes never left the crowd. "I can see a man's fear when I hold a blade to his throat, Valerio. I know what they'll do to survive. I need to know who has a soul before I find the one who has none." He had to do this because the last time his family trusted blindly, the last time they believed the sycophantic praise and smiling lies, they ended up in coffins. It was a lesson carved into his very being. The traitor who had helped orchestrate it was still out there, a ghost he hunted relentlessly, and Alessio would burn the world down to find him. In the shadow of his power, he felt utterly alone. This entire masquerade was born of that isolation. He was searching for one person, just one, who wasn't wearing a mask. Without another word, he stepped from the shadows to begin his test. He approached the daughter of a shipping magnate, a woman dripping in diamonds, and offered a polite, quiet smile. "May I have this dance?" She looked him up and down, her lip curling in a delicate sneer. "I don't think so." She turned her back on him, a dismissal as sharp and cold as the diamonds at her throat. He moved on. A politician's wife laughed in his face. A celebrated actress simply ignored him, as if he were a piece of furniture. Each rejection was a small, familiar confirmation of the world's rotten core. The taste of ashes filled his mouth. He was about to retreat, to let the ghost of his hope die, when his gaze landed on her. A servant girl, clutching a tray with exhaustion in her posture but a fire in her eyes.
The rejections were brutal. Annalise watched from a distance as the quiet, handsome man with the sad eyes was turned away, again and again. The women's laughter was a physical thing, sharp and cruel, and with every dismissal, she saw him retreat further into himself. The air thickened with unspoken threats of social irrelevance. Her instincts screamed danger, not from him, but for him. She knew that feeling, the sting of being deemed worthless by a glance. No matter how hard she tried to look away, to focus on the empty glasses and the overflowing ashtrays, she couldn't. Her feet moved before her mind could protest. What was she doing? Getting involved was stupid. Getting noticed was dangerous. Yet, as if pulled by an invisible string, she found herself standing near him. She didn't know what scared her more: the thought of her supervisor seeing her step out of line, or the thought of walking away and leaving this stranger to drown in their contempt. In that moment, everything changed. She leaned closer, the scent of starch from her uniform mingling with the expensive air around him. Her voice trembled, but held firm. "Are you okay?" she whispered, the words feeling loud in the cavernous room.
The moment their eyes locked, the world outside of them went silent. The clinking glasses, the false laughter, the entire charade of the gala, it all faded into a distant hum. He saw her, truly saw her, and it was like a starving man seeing bread. She wasn't looking at his suit or his shoes. She was looking at the flicker of hurt he thought he'd hidden so well. Her question stunned him. It was so simple, so real. In a world of calculations and transactions, she offered kindness, a commodity more precious than any jewel in this room. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared, mesmerized. She took a small, nervous breath, her gaze unwavering. "Would you like me to be your date?" The air between them crackled with tension. The question was an absurdity. A servant girl asking the hidden king of Europe's underworld to be her date. It was madness. It was perfect. A smile, slow and dangerous, and something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine, touched his lips. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and his hunt for a traitor was suddenly overshadowed by a new, far more compelling hunt. His voice was a low, threatening murmur, a sound that held the promise of empires and ruin. "I would like that very much." And with those simple words, spoken under the weight of his stare, Annalise sealed a fate she couldn't possibly comprehend. There was no escaping what came next.
That night, sleep was a battlefield Annalise lost repeatedly. She kept seeing his eyes, dark, ancient, and filled with a loneliness that mirrored her own. The memory of his slow, dangerous smile was a brand on her mind. She woke with a gasp, the gray morning light of her tiny apartment feeling like a haven. It had just been a strange, stressful night, a weird, intense encounter. Nothing more. She clung to that thought like a prayer as she made tea, the chipped rim of her mug a familiar comfort against her lips. She had to focus on what was real, getting to her second job at the diner, paying the rent, and scrounging enough to visit Maya this weekend. The man at the gala was a phantom from a world that had nothing to do with her. But then a knock echoed through her apartment. It wasn't the landlord, and it wasn't the postman. It was a solid, authoritative sound that vibrated through the cheap wood of the door. Her breath caught. With every beat of her terrified heart, she patted over, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. When she opened it, the phantom was standing there, very much real. He was different now. The simple, ill-fitting suit was gone, replaced by a black coat so exquisitely tailored it seemed spun from shadows and power. Flanked by two men built like mountains, his presence filled the cramped hallway, suffocating the very air. The kind sadness in his eyes from last night was gone, replaced by a chilling possessiveness. Her thoughts spun into chaos because this man was not the one she had offered a moment of kindness to. This was a predator who had come to collect. "Annalise," he said, his voice no longer quiet but a low, resonant command. He knew her name. The fear coiled in her gut, thick and venomous. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her hand instinctively trying to push the door shut. Before she could move, he stopped it with a single calm hand, his strength effortless. His gaze was a physical touch, branding her. I know everything about you, he said, his voice dropping lower. I know about your sister, Maya. I know about the bills you cannot pay. And I know you are the only honest thing I have seen in 10 years. He stepped forward, forcing her back into her own apartment. Last night was not a chance meeting. It was a test. And you, little mouse, were the only one who passed. Her world tilted on its axis. A test? What are you talking about? I want you to leave, now! He almost smiled, a cold, sharp thing. No. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He was no longer a guest but an invader, a king in her pauper's home. Your kindness has a price, Annalise, he murmured, his dark eyes boring into hers. And I have come to collect.
Under the weight of his stare, she trembled, but she did not break. He saw the fire of defiance kindle in her wide, terrified eyes, and it was more intoxicating than any power he had ever wielded. This was why he was here. He was surrounded by vipers and sycophants, by men who would kill for him and women who would sell their souls to be near his throne. Yet none of them were real. They were all masks, all performances. But this girl, with her cheap apartment that smelled of tea and disinfectant, was genuine to the bone. Because of that, she was a priceless anomaly in his collection. And Alessio Volkov always claimed what was his. He watched her mind working, saw the desperate search for an escape route in her frantic gaze. You cannot be here, she said, her voice stronger now. I'll scream. I'll call the police. The threat was so naive it was almost charming. You could, he agreed, stepping further into the room and running a gloved finger along a dusty picture frame. Inside was a smiling photo of her and a younger girl, Maya. But the police will not come. Not for me. As if the city itself belonged to him, he spoke with an authority that was absolute. And screaming will only frighten your neighbors. He laid out his terms, his voice the calm, dispassionate tone he used when negotiating the fate of empires. I will wipe away every debt you have. Your sister will receive the finest medical care in the world in a private suite for as long as she needs it. You will never have to worry about money, or rent, or aching feet again. Her face, pale with fear, was now etched with disbelief and a flicker of hope that he found perversely satisfying to ignite. Why? Why would you do that? Because in return, he continued, closing the small space between them until he could feel the frantic beat of her pulse. You will come with me. You will live in my home by my rules. You will be mine. Her defiance surged, a beautiful, foolish thing. I'm not a thing to be bought. I would rather die. His gaze hardened, the predator within him rising to the surface. He leaned in, his voice a whisper of cold steel against her ear. That can be arranged. He paused, letting the unspoken promise of violence hang in the air. But your sister's fate is tied to your obedience. If you live, she thrives. If you run, or if you refuse, her care stops. Do you understand me? He pulled back to look into her eyes, to see the moment her spirit finally broke under the impossible weight of his choice. It was a necessary cruelty, the only language his world understood.
The car was a silent, moving tomb. Annalise sat on the buttery leather, as far from him as she could get, and watched her city slide by through the tinted windows. The familiar streets, the bustling crowds, the life she knew, it was all behind a dark sheet of glass now, a world she could see but no longer touch. The space between them crackled with tension, so thick she could barely breathe. He hadn't spoken a word since she'd numbly nodded her consent, the unspoken sacrifice for Maya a stone in her throat. Her old life had been stripped away in the span of a breath. The car descended into the concrete heart of the city, pulling into the private underground garage of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds like a needle of black glass. It was a monument to power, cold and unbreachable. Her new prison. She was led through a private elevator that opened not into a lobby, but directly into the sky. The penthouse was breathtaking and soul-crushing. One entire wall was a window looking down upon the city, the tiny lights of cars and buildings a glittering carpet below. The floors were white marble, the furniture was minimalist art, and the air was cold and sterile, smelling of nothing at all. It was beautiful, opulent, and utterly devoid of life. It was a cage, and its bars were made of diamonds and glass. Without warning, the elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft, final click that echoed in the cavernous silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. There was no going back. He stood by the massive window, a dark silhouette against the dying light. As if fate demanded it, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable, his power an invisible, crushing force. He had not just taken her from her home. He had stolen her from her world and placed her at the very top of his, where the fall would be long and lethal. "These are the rules of your new life," Alessio Volkov began, his voice echoing in the cold, beautiful emptiness. The rules were simple, brutal, and absolute. You will not try to leave. You will not try to contact anyone from your past life. You will eat what is prepared for you, wear what is provided for you, and you will obey me in all things. Alessio's voice was a flat, cold slate in the opulent silence of the penthouse. "Do this," he had finished, his eyes boring into hers, "and your sister will have a life she could only dream of. Defy me, and you will learn what happens to things that break." Her first day in the gilded cage was a lesson in silent suffocation. She woke in a bed the size of her old bedroom, draped in silk sheets that felt like cool water against her skin. A closet, bigger than her entire apartment, was filled with clothes in her exact size, dresses of silk, cashmere sweaters, shoes with blood-red soles. It was a princess's wardrobe for a prisoner. She explored the penthouse not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need for knowledge, because knowledge was the only weapon she had left. She saw the state-of-the-art kitchen, the library filled with leather-bound classics, the infinity pool that bled into the skyline. But then she also saw the hidden cameras nestled in the corners of the ceilings. She saw the silent, grim-faced guards posted at the elevator, and she saw the profound, lonely emptiness in every perfectly polished surface. Her thoughts spun into chaos. Was this a life or a beautiful death? The city sprawled below her, a glittering, vibrant promise of a freedom she had lost. That night, she couldn't stand the silence, the sheer perfection of her prison, for another second. She padded into the vast, dark kitchen, her bare feet cold on the marble floor. Without thinking, she opened a cupboard and found a simple ceramic mug and a box of chamomile tea. It was a ghost of her old life, a small, mundane ritual in a world that was anything but. As the kettle began to whisper, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Alessio. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. He just stood there watching her, his presence a palpable force that seemed to drink all the air from the room. He wasn't threatening her, not with words or actions, but his gaze was a physical touch, branding her in the pale moonlight filtering through the window. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He was a king observing a curious creature in his domain. The kettle shrieked, and she flinched, the sound unnaturally violent in the quiet. She poured the steaming water, her hands trembling. Deep down, she knew the truth. This small act of making tea wasn't defiance. It was a desperate plea to remember who she was.
That afternoon, a package had arrived. It was delivered by a courier with sweating palms who couldn't meet his eyes. Alessio knew who it was from before he even saw the card. The box was from a high-end jeweler, wrapped in peacock blue paper. The card simply read, "A welcome to the city's newest treasure. M.B. Marco Bellini," a snake who smiled too much and whose ambition was a festering wound. The unspoken promise of violence hung in the air just from the man's initials. Alessio had the box swept for explosives and toxins before bringing it into the main living area where Annalise was sitting, staring out at the city as if it were a memory. Without a word, he placed the box on the marble table in front of her. "Open it," he commanded, his voice devoid of warmth. Her eyes, wide and wary, lifted from the box to his face. She hesitated, her instincts screaming danger. What is it? A gift. He watched her, his focus absolute. This was another test, a more important one. He needed to know if she could be bought, because if she could be, she was a liability. He had built his empire on the certainty that everyone had a price. It was the foundation of his power and his pain. Under his possessive gaze, she slowly untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a diamond necklace. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a statement of wealth so obscene it was vulgar, a constellation of cold, brilliant fire. He saw the flicker of awe in her eyes. No one could deny its beauty. But then, something else replaced it. Disgust. She looked at it not as a treasure but as a collar, as if it were a chain forged just for her. She gently closed the lid. "I don't want it." Her voice was soft but firm, a sliver of steel wrapped in velvet. A slow, cold satisfaction spread through him. He had expected greed, calculation, perhaps even a flicker of triumph. He had expected the same grasping nature he saw in every other woman who entered his orbit. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable integrity. In that moment, something inside him shifted. She wasn't a liability. She was an asset of a kind he had never known. "Good," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He picked up the box, his knuckles white. "Never accept gifts from my enemies." Without another word, he walked to the balcony and in one fluid motion, hurled the necklace into the abyss of the city below.
The next evening, the unspoken war he had dragged her into became terrifyingly real. "You will join me for dinner tonight," Alessio stated, leaving no room for argument. Moments later, a maid appeared with a velvet dress the color of a midnight sky. It felt like dressing a doll for a play she didn't know the lines to. When she entered the dining room, her breath caught. It wasn't just them. A group of people were seated around a long, formal table, their faces hard and watchful. On Alessio's right sat an older man with cold, calculating eyes whom she heard someone call Valerio. The other men were built like weapons, their suits unable to hide their raw power. The women beside them were beautiful, clad in jewels and silence, their eyes sharp and filled with a mixture of jealousy and contempt as they looked at her. The air thickened with unspoken threats, and the clinking of silverware on porcelain sounded like the cocking of guns. Alessio pulled out the chair directly to his left, a place of honor and a spotlight of danger. "This is Annalise," he said to the table, his voice leaving no doubt as to his ownership. "She is with me now." The dinner was an agonizing performance. She could feel Valerio's gaze on her, dissecting her, judging her. The women whispered behind their hands. Her food tasted like ash. Not only that, but with every beat of her terrified heart, she understood that this was her new reality, a world of predators where she was the only prey. She had to escape. Not for her own sanity, but for a breath of air. Feigning the need for a powder room, she slipped out of the dining room, her heels silent on the plush runner. The hallway was empty, and she leaned against the cool wall, her pulse hammering. But then, she heard low, urgent voices from a partially open study door nearby. "The shipment at the docks is vulnerable. Bellini's spies are everywhere," one voice growled. It was Valerio. "Alessio is aware," the consigliere replied, his voice like gravel. "But he is distracted. This girl makes him careless." "Careless gets us killed, Valerio. If Bellini hits that shipment, we lose our main port access." A defiant retort died on her lips as she pressed herself flatter against the wall. She shouldn't be hearing this. This was knowledge that could get her killed. As the silence roared in her ears, she realized she was no longer just a captive. She was a secret keeper. And in a world built on secrets and lies, that was the most dangerous thing to be.
The words she'd overheard, "The shipment at the docks is vulnerable," were a ghost that had haunted him since dinner. Valerio was right. Her presence was a distraction, but not in the way his consigliere thought. It wasn't carelessness. It was a new, unfamiliar variable in an equation he had spent his life perfecting. He stood before the vast window in his office, the city lights a cold, distant fire below. He had sent men to reinforce the docks, of course. He was not a fool. Still, a knot of unease tightened in his gut. Bellini was a rat, but even a rat could get lucky. He was turning over the strategic possibilities in his mind when the secure line on his desk buzzed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the silence. His man at the port was screaming. Gunshots crackled through the speaker, a chaotic symphony of violence and death. "They came out of the water! Bellini's men, they're everywhere! We're being overrun!" The line went dead. A cold, lethal calm descended over Alessio. The city held its breath as he processed the attack, the loss, the sheer audacity. His gaze drifted from the phone to the security monitor on his wall. He keyed in the code for the main living area, his jaw tight. And there she was, Annalise. Curled on a sofa, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, she had fallen asleep reading a book. An angel in the heart of his fortress. A profound, possessive rage washed over him. A rage directed entirely at Marco Bellini. The rat hadn't just attacked his business. He had dared to disturb the peace of his home. Of her home. He was about to turn away when a soft, piercing alarm began to blare through the penthouse. The silent alarm. The one that meant a breach from within. Before he could move, his office doors burst open. It was not one of his guards. It was a cleaner, a man with a forgettable face he'd seen 100 times. The man's eyes were wide with a fanatic's glee, and in his hand was a glint of steel. He wasn't lunging for Alessio. He was sprinting past him, toward the living area, toward Annalise. In that moment, the entire Volkov empire, the war with Bellini, the ghost of the traitor from his past, it all vanished. There was only one thing in the world that mattered. Getting to her.
Annalise was ripped from a dream of running through a field of wildflowers by a sound that didn't belong. A soft, insistent beeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her eyes fluttered open. The room was bathed in the red, pulsing glow of an emergency light she hadn't known existed. The air thickened with unspoken threats, a silence more terrifying than any scream. She sat up, the book tumbling from her lap, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. What was happening? The unspoken promise of violence hung in the air, and then it exploded into her reality. A man, one of the cleaning staff, a quiet man she'd seen polishing the marble floors, burst into the room. But his face was twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred, and he was holding a knife, its edge catching the pulsing red light. Her instincts screamed danger, a primal, paralyzing fear that locked her limbs. He wasn't looking at her as a person. He was looking at her as a tool, an obstacle on his path to the office behind her, to Alessio. In the span of a breath, everything happened at once. The man lunged. A roar of pure fury erupted from the office. A dark shape blurred past her, moving with the grace of a predator. It was Alessio. He didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate. He simply reacted. Before the cleaner's knife could find its mark in her, Alessio slammed into him, shoving her so hard she tumbled back onto the sofa out of the way. The blade, meant for her heart, instead carved a deep, vicious line across Alessio's arm as he neutralized the threat. There was a sickening crunch, a strangled gasp, and then the assassin crumpled to the floor, a broken puppet. Alessio stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his eyes burning with a darkness that terrified and, to her utter shame, thrilled her. He had saved her. The monster, her captor, the king of this gilded cage, had thrown himself in front of a blade for her. He was hurt. Because of her. Her world tilted on its axis. The sight of the dark blood welling from the gash in his arm, staining the perfect white fabric of his shirt, broke through her fear. Without thinking, she scrambled off the sofa, grabbing a silk throw pillow and pressing it against his bleeding arm. "You're hurt."
The pain was a distant fire, irrelevant. All he could see was her face, pale with shock, her eyes wide with a terrifying, confusing mix of fear and concern. Her small hands were on him, pressing the ridiculously expensive pillow to his wound, her touch a searing brand on his skin. He had faced down entire cartels without flinching. He had walked through fire and blood to build his empire. He had never, ever put himself in harm's way for another. Until now. The realization was a tremor in the foundation of his soul. He felt a profound, dangerous shift. She was no longer a possession he was protecting. She was a part of him that he would die for. His personal guards swarmed the room, their faces grim, weapons drawn. They dragged the assassin's body away, the efficiency of their cleanup a stark reminder of the world they lived in. But Alessio barely noticed. He couldn't take his eyes off Annalise. Her touch, her wide, horrified eyes, they were the only things that felt real. "Get Valerio on the line," he commanded one of his men, his voice a low growl. His gaze, however, remained locked on her. "And get the doctor. Now." He let her guide him to a chair, a weakness he would never have permitted from anyone else. The pain in his arm was beginning to throb, a hot, insistent beat. She was still pressing the pillow to the wound, her knuckles white, her face a mask of concentration. Because of this, he allowed the vulnerability. Because she was the one tending to him. She was looking at him not as a don, not as a king, but as a man who was bleeding. After the doctor had stitched the wound, a brutal-looking line of black thread against his skin, and the chaos had subsided, they were alone again. The silence roared between them, filled with the ghost of violence and the birth of something new and terrifying. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the truth. Keeping her here to protect her wasn't enough. The war had come to his door, to her door. He rose to his feet, the motion fluid despite his injury. He walked to her, backing her up against the cold glass of the window until the lights of the city were a fallen constellation at her back. Under the weight of his stare, she trembled. "You see now," he whispered, his voice cold steel, a stark contrast to the fire in his eyes. "You see what this world is." He raised his uninjured hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "I brought you here to keep you safe. I failed." His thumb traced her jawline, a touch that was both a caress and a claim. "Which means the rules have changed." "Now," he murmured, his voice dropping to a possessive, unbreakable vow, "the only way you leave my side is in a coffin."
The aftermath of the attack was a quiet, cold war. Alessio's vow, "the only way you leave my side is in a coffin," was not a threat. It was a cage forged of his own paranoid protection, which meant Annalise was now a permanent fixture in his life, a silent shadow in his office as he commanded his empire with the lethal precision of a surgeon. She watched him move his soldiers around the city like chess pieces. She listened to the clipped, coded conversations, and she felt the suffocating weight of his world pressing in on her. The men who came and went, men with dead eyes and blood on their knuckles, looked at her with a new curiosity. She was no longer just the Don's new pet. She was the girl he had bled for. His war council was a storm of frustrated anger. Valerio, his arm in a sling from a ricochet, paced the length of the Persian rug. "Bellini is a ghost. We hit his warehouses, we squeeze his associates, but he remains untouched. He knows our moves before we make them." The other men murmured in agreement, their faces grim. Alessio stood before his map of the city, a red pin marking the location of the docks, a bleeding wound in his territory. His silence was more intimidating than any shout. Annalise sat in a leather chair by the fire, ordered to be there, ordered to be silent. But the words she'd overheard at that horrible dinner party echoed in her mind. "Bellini's spies are everywhere. Careless gets us killed." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Speaking was a risk. Remaining silent was a different kind of risk. If Alessio fell, what would happen to her? What would happen to Maya? Deep down, she knew the truth. His survival was now her survival. Her voice trembled but held firm as she broke the suffocating silence. "The cleaner," she said, the words feeling impossibly loud. Every head in the room snapped toward her. Valerio's eyes narrowed. Alessio's back remained to her, but she saw his shoulders tense. The man who attacked us. You called him a cleaner. But at the dinner, I overheard Valerio say Bellini has spies everywhere. Valerio took a half step forward. What are you talking about, girl? Alessio slowly turned, his dark eyes pinning her to the chair. The air crackled with tension. Let her speak. Her breath caught, but she pushed on, her words tumbling out. He said you were being distracted, that the shipment at the docks was vulnerable. It was right before the attack. The spy, the cleaner. He wasn't just here to kill you. He was here to listen. The moment the words left her lips, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She saw the realization dawn on the faces of these hardened men. They had been looking for a leak from the outside, a compromised soldier, a bugged phone line. They had never considered the enemy was already inside, wearing a servant's uniform. Without another word, Alessio crossed the room to a hidden panel, revealing a bank of security monitors. He rewound the footage from the days leading up to the attack. And there it was, the cleaner, mopping the floor outside Alessio's office, lingering just a little too long. Alessio looked at her, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something new. Respect burned in the depths of his eyes. He had kept her by his side as a possession to be guarded. But in that moment, she had become a weapon. In the shadow of his power, he walked over to her, dismissing his men with a flick of his hand. He crouched before her, taking her chin in his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. You did well, little mouse, he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous purr. Very well. He rewarded her not with jewels or clothes, but with a small, calculated piece of his world. From now on, when I have counsel, you will not just sit. You will listen.
Because of her, the board was reset. Annalise's observation was the key that unlocked Bellini's entire strategy. The spies weren't just cleaners. They were gardeners, couriers, kitchen staff, ghosts who moved through the homes of his capos, gathering whispers. It was a brilliant, insidious network, and Alessio felt a surge of cold, predatory glee at the thought of dismantling it, piece by painful piece. He used her insight to set a trap, feeding false information about a new shipment to a capo whose house staff he now watched with hawk-like intensity. The trap sprung perfectly. Bellini's men ambushed a convoy of empty trucks, and Alessio's soldiers were waiting for them. It was a slaughter. A message. He watched the aftermath on a live drone feed, the chaos and fire a beautiful, destructive painting. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Annalise standing beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror at the violence on the screen. He felt a perverse need for her to see this, to understand the brutal cost of their survival. This is how we win, he said, his voice flat. This is what I do to those who threaten what is mine. A temporary victory, but the war was far from over. That evening, as a tense, fragile peace settled over the penthouse, his secure phone buzzed. It was a single, untraceable message, an image file. He opened it, and the cold fury that had been simmering within him exploded into a white-hot inferno. It was a photograph, not of a dead soldier, not of a burning warehouse. It was a picture of Maya's hospital, and standing just outside the entrance, smiling casually at the camera, was one of Bellini's most vicious enforcers. The message was clear. I can't touch you, but I can touch her. The air thickened with his unspoken rage. He felt Annalise's presence behind him and turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't have to say a word. He simply showed her the phone. The color drained from her face. A choked, terrified sob escaped her lips, and the sound was a knife twisting in his gut. The fear in her eyes, the raw, primal terror of a sister for her sibling. It ignited a protective instinct so ferocious it almost blinded him. He had faced down death. He had ordered executions. He had built an empire on a foundation of fear. But this was different. Bellini hadn't targeted his business. He hadn't targeted his life. He had targeted her family. He pulled her into his arms, a shockingly gentle gesture. She collapsed against him, her body racked with tremors. In that moment he made a vow, not to her but to the universe, his voice a low, brutal promise against her hair. I will burn his entire world to the ground for this.
To neutralize the threat, there could be no more traps, no more games. There was only one way. Alessio had to meet Bellini, a meeting brokered by the old families on supposed neutral ground. And because of his vow, because he trusted no one, Annalise had to go with him. They left the penthouse fortress in the dead of night, slipping into the city's dark arteries in an armored car. The safe house was a small, brutally minimalist apartment in a part of the city that had no name. The silence inside was a living thing, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant wail of a siren. The fear was a physical presence, a cold hand wrapped around her heart. The meeting was tomorrow. Tonight, they were just two people in a box, waiting for the world to explode. He stood by the window, a drink in his hand, a ghost staring into the darkness. She watched him, seeing not the dawn, but the man, the weight of his entire world resting on his shoulders. She didn't know why she did it, but she walked over and took the glass from his hand, setting it aside. The moment their eyes locked, the tension that had been simmering between them for weeks finally ignited. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't sweet. It was a desperate, raw collision of fear and desire, of two people finding a fleeting moment of life in the shadow of death. His mouth crashed down on hers, a kiss of possession and desperation, and she met him with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. The lines between captor and captive, protector and protected, didn't just blur, they burned away completely. Later, in the quiet darkness of the small bedroom, lying tangled in the sheets, she felt the aftermath of the storm. In a single heartbeat, the world had shifted again. She traced the line of the new scar on his arm, a permanent reminder of the moment he had chosen her over himself. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why did you save me?" He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, haunted thing she had never heard before. "Because they didn't save them." Her breath caught. Them. As if a dam had broken, he told her everything. He spoke of a night long ago, of laughter and family, of his father, the dawn before him, and his mother and younger brother. He spoke of a betrayal not by an enemy, but by their most trusted friend, a man they called Uncle, a man who had opened the gates and let the wolves in, a man whose identity was still a ghost that haunted his every waking moment. He spoke of hiding in a secret panic room, a child of 10, watching on a small black and white monitor as his entire family was systematically executed. In that moment, everything changed. He wasn't a monster. He was a survivor. A boy who had been forced to become a king on a throne of ash and blood. He had pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, not as a captor, but as a man warding off the ghosts of his past. And Annalise held him back, realizing with a terrifying certainty that she was no longer just his prisoner. She was the keeper of his darkest secret. The neutral ground for the meeting was the top floor of a silent, empty skyscraper, a glass box suspended in the night sky. The air inside was cold and smelled of recycled air and faint antiseptic cleaner. It was a place for transactions, not for life. Annalise stood by Alessio's side, her hand clutching his, a silent promise of solidarity that felt both terrifying and right. She was no longer just his captive. She was his confidant, the keeper of his ghosts. She was in this with him. Moments later, the elevator doors hissed open and Marco Bellini strode in. He was a peacock of a man, dressed in a flamboyant suit, his smile as wide and predatory as a shark's. He was flanked by his own soldiers, but his eyes, glittering with malevolent glee, were fixed on Annalise. Behind Alessio, Valerio stood like a stone sentinel, his gaze unreadable. Alessio, Bellini began, spreading his hands wide as if to embrace the tension. So glad you could make it. And I see you brought the stray puppy you picked up. Watch your mouth, Marco. Alessio's voice was a low, threatening murmur, his grip tightening on her hand. Bellini just laughed, a sound that scraped against the silence. Oh, I'm shaking. You've grown soft, Volkov, letting a woman cloud your judgment. A nobody at that. It's a fatal mistake in our world. Before either could speak again, the trap sprung. The emergency lights plunged the room into a blood-red darkness as armed men smashed through the glass walls from the outside, rappelling down from the roof. The world exploded into a storm of shouting and gunfire. Alessio reacted in the span of a breath, shoving Annalise behind him, his body a shield. He moved with a brutal, mesmerizing grace, a dance of death he had clearly perfected. The chaos was a blur of noise and terror. But then, she heard Bellini's voice, screaming over the din as he was dragged back by his men toward the elevator. A triumphant, venomous snarl. You think you know who to trust, Volkov? Ask your little whore how I knew you'd be here. Ask her about the calls she made. The fighting stopped as quickly as it began, leaving a wake of shattered glass and bleeding bodies. But Bellini's words remained, hanging in the air like poison gas. Annalise's blood ran cold. Calls? What calls? The moment their eyes locked, she saw it. The fragile, nascent trust they had built, the vulnerability he had shared in the darkness of the safe house. It all shattered. His face became a mask of ice, colder and more terrifying than any rage. The man who had held her, who had bled for her, was gone. In his place was the Dawn, the king forged in betrayal. Take her, he commanded his men, his voice devoid of all emotion. Alessio, no, she cried, reaching for him. It's a lie. You know it's a lie. His men grabbed her arms, their grips like iron. She looked from his cold, dead eyes to Valerio, who watched with a look of grim, sorrowful duty. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted back to its original, brutal axis. Under the weight of his stare, a stare that now held nothing but contempt, she was dragged away, her pleas swallowed by the wail of distant sirens.
The silence in the aftermath was a tomb. His men were securing the area, but Alessio saw none of it. Bellini's words echoed in his skull, a venomous mantra that awakened every ghost he had ever tried to bury. Ask her about the calls she made. It was the same script, the same smiling face, the same knife in the back. The world he had built was designed to prevent this very thing from ever happening again. Yet, despite that, here he was. Valerio approached, his face a mask of loyal concern. He was holding a small, cheap burner phone in his hand. We found this in her things from the safe house, boss, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Hidden in the lining of her coat. Alessio took the phone, his fingers numb. He scrolled through the call log. There were 3 calls, all made within the last 24 hours, all to a single, saved number. A number he recognized with a sickening certainty. It belonged to Bellini's top enforcer. The unspoken promise of violence hung in the air, but this time it was directed inward, at his own colossal stupidity. The phone felt heavy, a block of ice burning his hand. He had told her his deepest secret. He had let her see his weakness. He had laid the ghost of his family at her feet, and she had used it to sharpen the blade for his enemies. The pain was so profound, so familiar, it was almost a comfort. It was the pain of his father's world, the pain he was born into. Deep down he knew the truth. Trust was a fool's game, and he had just played his final hand. Where is she? He asked, his voice a dead, flat thing. In the car, waiting for your orders, Valerio replied. Alessio's gaze lifted to the shattered window, to the cold, indifferent city below. He had wanted her to be different. He had allowed himself to believe in the fantasy of her kindness, her integrity. But in the end, she was just like all the rest. Another mask, another lie. Take her back to the penthouse, he commanded, his voice like cold steel. Lock her in the guest suite. Post guards at her door. She is not to speak to anyone. She is not to see anyone. She is not to exist. He turned to face his consigliere, his eyes empty. She is a traitor, and I will deal with her.
She was thrown not into the master suite where they had slept, but into a small, sterile guest room at the far end of the penthouse. The door slammed shut, the click of the electronic lock echoing the sound of her heart breaking. This prison was infinitely worse than the first. The first was the cage of a captor. This was the dungeon of a traitor. She was no longer a possession, she was a disgrace. She paced the room like a caged animal, her mind a screaming vortex of confusion and despair. A burner phone? Calls? It was impossible. A lie. A setup so perfect, so cruel, that it could only have been designed by someone who knew Alessio's deepest wound. Someone who knew the ghost of betrayal was the only thing that could truly break him. And it had worked. She beat her fists against the solid wood of the door, screaming his name until her throat was raw, but only silence answered. She sank to the cold marble floor, the luxurious silk of her dress a mockery of her situation. She had been so stupid, so naive. She had let herself believe in the man behind the monster. She had seen his pain and mistaken it for a soul. As the silence stretched into an eternity, she wrapped her arms around herself, a single desolate tear tracing a path down her cheek. She had survived his cruelty, his possession, his dangerous world. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never survive his belief that she had betrayed him. She had fallen in love with a king of ashes, and now she was just another ghost in his haunted castle.
Meanwhile, in his office, Alessio stood in the darkness. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling empire of lies. He had won. Bellini was in the wind, his operation crippled. His own organization was secure. He had everything he had ever fought for, and he was utterly, completely alone. The silence roared. He could still feel the phantom touch of her hand on his arm, still hear her terrified whisper as he told her about his family. Had it all been an act? A long, calculated seduction to find his breaking point? His mind, the cold, strategic engine of his power, presented the evidence. The phone, the calls, the perfectly timed betrayal. But his heart, a thing he thought had died a decade ago, whispered her name. He saw her face at the gala, her disarming sincerity a beacon in a sea of artifice. He saw her defiant eyes as she refused Bellini's diamonds. He saw her tending to his wound, her touch gentle and sure. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reconcile that woman with the cold data on the burner phone, which meant one of them was a lie. He picked up a heavy crystal glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He had built his life on one single, unbreakable rule: trust no one. He had broken that rule for her, and she had proven him right all along. The pain was a bitter, familiar taste in his mouth, with a roar of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound no one had ever heard him make. He hurled the glass against the bulletproof window. It shattered, spraying whiskey and glittering shards across the floor, but the window remained unscratched. Just like him, trapped, unbreakable, and completely, utterly alone. The silence roared in his office, a living entity made of shattered glass and the ghost of her scent. For 2 days, Alessio had existed in this self-imposed tomb, moving through the motions of his empire while a cold, dead weight sat in his chest. He had reasserted control, crushed the last vestiges of Bellini's attack, and instilled a fresh wave of terror in his men. In the shadow of his power, his kingdom was secure, and it meant nothing. He was haunted, not by the violence, not by the war, but by the memory of her terrified eyes as his men dragged her away. The evidence was absolute: the phone, the calls, the betrayal. But her face was the flaw in his perfect, cold logic. He had to be sure, because certainty was the only god he prayed to. As if pulled by an invisible string, he found himself before the security monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He didn't want to see it, but he had to. He pulled up the archived footage from the safe house, the hours before the meeting. He watched them together, a sick feeling coiling in his gut. He saw her vulnerability, her trust. He saw his own. Then, he isolated the hours she was alone. Nothing. Frustrated, he was about to shut it down when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A different camera angle. The hallway. He rewound. There. While he and Annalise were in the bedroom, lost in a world of whispered secrets and desperate passion, a figure slipped down the hall. It was Valerio, his trusted consigliere, his father's most loyal man. He watched as Valerio paused by the door to Annalise's empty room, looked both ways, and slipped inside. He was out again in less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds to plant a phone. 30 seconds to destroy a life. 30 seconds to betray a family for the second time. The truth hit him not like a wave, but like a shard of ice driving straight through his heart. It wasn't her. It had never been her. It was him. Valerio, the man who had survived the massacre, the man who had mentored him, guided him, stood by his side as he rebuilt his father's empire from ashes. The ghost he had been hunting his entire life wasn't an unknown traitor. It was the man he called his uncle. The betrayal was so absolute, so monstrous, it almost broke him. The quiet despair he'd been marinating in for 2 days evaporated, replaced by a rage so pure and cold, it was crystalline. He now had a purpose. He had a reckoning to deliver. Without another word to the ghosts in his office, he strode toward her prison.
Annalise had stopped counting the hours. Time was measured in the trays of untouched food left at her door and the rising and falling of the city lights outside her sealed window. Hope, she had discovered, was a slow and painful thing to die. She had replayed every moment with him, every word, every touch, searching for the lie. Was it all a game to him? A cruel, calculated seduction to break a nobody for sport? Her thoughts spun into chaos until they settled on a single bleak truth. It didn't matter. He believed she was a traitor. In his world, there was no coming back from that. She was a ghost now, waiting for a sentence that would never be announced. Then, she heard it. The sharp, definitive click of the electronic lock on her door. Her breath caught. This was it. He had come to finish it. The door swung open, and he stood there, a dark, imposing silhouette against the hallway light. She steeled herself for the cold fury, for the final, brutal judgment. But as he stepped into the room, the light caught his face, and her heart stopped. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. Under the weight of his stare, she saw a mask of raw, agonizing regret. His eyes, those dark, unreadable pools, were filled with a pain that mirrored her own. Annalise, he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. Before either could speak, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch both a plea and a brand. It wasn't you, he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was never you. It was him. It was Valerio. The words hung in the air, a shocking, impossible truth. Valerio? The loyal, grim-faced consigliere? But the phone. He planted it, Alessio said, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. He's the traitor. He was the one who helped them kill my family all those years ago. He played the long game, waiting for me to trust someone, waiting for me to have a weakness he could exploit. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the full, horrifying weight of his lifelong burden. He used you to try and destroy me. A defiant retort died on her lips as a new, furious energy surged through her. They had both been played, manipulated by a ghost who had been standing beside them all along. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling but held firm. A slow, dangerous smile touched Alessio's lips, a smile that promised blood and retribution. "We," he said, emphasizing the word, "are going to destroy him." He explained his plan, a trap that was both elegant and brutal. But it had a flaw. It required someone to get inside Bellini's inner circle during the final meeting, someone who could move unseen. "They'll be using a catering service for the meeting," he said, frustrated. "Third party neutral. My men can't get close." In that moment, everything changed. Her past, her invisibility, the life she had been so desperate to escape. It was now their greatest weapon. "I can," she said, her voice steady. "I used to work for that company. I know their roots. I know their uniforms. I know how to disappear in plain sight." His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief followed by a dark, dangerous admiration. He had taken her to possess her, kept her to protect her, but now he was seeing her for what she truly was, his equal. He pulled her flush against him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not about passion, but about sealing a vow. It was a kiss of shared purpose, of two broken people forging an empire on a foundation of betrayal. "This time," she whispered against his mouth, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We trust each other."
The next night, the stage was set. The plan was a symphony of violence waiting for its cue. He would be the bait. She would be the blade. They would be the reckoning. He arranged the final meeting with Bellini at a neutral ground penthouse hotel, under the pretense of surrendering a piece of his territory to appease the old families. Valerio, the loyal consigliere, would be at his side, blissfully unaware that he was a dead man walking. As he dressed in a suit as black as his intentions, he watched Annalise on a hidden monitor. She was in a service prep room in the hotel's basement, dressed in the crisp, anonymous uniform of a caterer. She moved with a quiet confidence, her hair tucked under a cap, her face a mask of calm focus. To anyone else, she was just another servant. To him, she was a queen in disguise, about to checkmate a king. Could she do this? Could this girl, who had offered him kindness at a gala, walk willingly into the heart of the serpent's nest? The risk was immense, but it was the only way. Meanwhile, Annalise loaded a tray with champagne flutes, her hands steady. She could feel the rhythmic thumping of her own heart, a war drum counting down to the final battle. Her old life and her new one were about to collide in a spectacular, bloody finale. She took a deep breath, the scent of industrial cleaner and cheap champagne a familiar ghost. She was ready. Alessio and Valerio rode the private elevator up in silence. The space between them crackled with a tension only Alessio could feel. "You seem tense, my boy," Valerio said, adjusting his tie. "There is no dishonor in a strategic retreat. We will live to fight another day." Alessio just looked at him, a flat, dead stare. "You're right, Valerio," he said, his voice a low, chilling promise. "Today is a day for endings." The elevator doors hissed open. Marco Bellini was waiting, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken the great Alessio Volkov. He had no idea he was already dead. As they stepped into the room, the trap was set, the players in place. All they needed now was the catalyst. Right on cue, there was a soft knock at the door, and a young woman in a catering uniform entered, her head bowed respectfully, a tray of champagne flutes in her hands. She kept her eyes down, a perfect picture of a servant, invisible and unimportant. Bellini didn't even give her a first glance. Valerio barely registered her presence. But Alessio saw her, and as she raised her eyes to meet his for a fraction of a second, he saw the fire burning there. The door to the penthouse suite closed, sealing them all inside, and the ghosts of the past walked in to claim their due. The air in the room was a held breath, a moment stretched taut before the snap. Marco Bellini preened, a self-satisfied wolf who believed he had cornered his rival. Valerio stood beside him, a statue of false loyalty, his face etched with concern that was a masterful lie. They saw a defeated Don, a man brought to his knees by a woman. They were fools. They saw the lure, but they had no idea they were already caught in the jaws of the trap. "So, Volkov," Bellini gloated, pouring himself a drink. "You've finally come to your senses. A wise decision. This city is too small for two kings. Alessio's gaze was cold granite. He ignored Bellini, his eyes locking on Valerio. "You agree with this, old friend?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You believe a strategic retreat is the honorable path?" Valerio shifted, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I believe in the survival of the family, Alessio. Always." "The family," Alessio repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Tell me, Valerio, when you stood by and watched my father, my mother, my brother die, was that for the survival of the family?" The silence that followed was a physical blow. Bellini froze, his glass halfway to his lips. Valerio's face went white, his carefully constructed mask crumbling to dust. What madness is this?" he stammered. Alessio took a slow step forward, his presence filling the room, suffocating. "The madness of a boy who watched a ghost on a security monitor. A ghost who looked just like you, Valerio. A ghost who opened a door and let the wolves in." As if fate demanded it, the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, the confession hanging in the air before it was even spoken. Valerio's fear was instantly replaced by a sneering, long-buried resentment. "He was weak. Your father was sentimental. He was going to make peace with our rivals, give away what we had bled for. I did what was necessary to preserve our strength." "And what of me?" Alessio's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "You raised me, you mentored me. Why keep me alive?" "Because you had the killer's instinct he lacked," Valerio spat, his face contorted with rage. "I forged you into the perfect weapon, but you, just like him, were flawed. You let this girl," he gestured dismissively toward Annalise, who stood frozen by the door, "this servant get inside your head. You grew weak, just like he did." That was the cue.
Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. With every beat of her terrified heart, she held the tray, a perfect picture of an invisible servant. But under the tray, her other hand held a phone, its screen glowing with the red icon of a live stream, broadcasting Valerio's every treasonous word to a private channel watched by every capo in the Volkov family. This was it. The moment of truth. "He's right, you know," Bellini chimed in, laughing as he finally grasped the drama unfolding. "She was your downfall, Alessio, the perfect tool to break you. A little bird who sang all your secrets to us." Annalise took a small, deliberate step forward, her movement drawing every eye. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, no longer the whisper of a servant but the proclamation of a queen. She lifted her chin, her eyes locking with Valerio's. "Then I suppose your associates will enjoy this recording." She lifted the phone. In the span of a breath, the world exploded. Valerio lunged for her with a guttural roar of pure rage, but Alessio was faster. He moved like a phantom, a blur of black tailored cloth and brutal intent, intercepting his old mentor with a tackle that sent them crashing over the marble coffee table. Bellini's men drew their weapons. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, shattering glass and punching holes in the expensive art on the walls. Annalise dove behind a thick, overturned sofa, her ears ringing. The air thickened with the metallic scent of gunpowder and blood. Through a gap in the cushions, she saw Alessio fighting, a whirlwind of controlled violence. But then, she saw what he didn't. One of Bellini's men, recovering by the wall, was raising his gun, aiming it directly at Alessio's exposed back. "Alessio!" she screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. He reacted instantly, spinning just as the gun fired, the bullet meant for his heart instead tearing through the flesh of his shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. He returned fire, and the gunman collapsed. In that moment of distraction, Bellini himself made a desperate move, grabbing Annalise and pulling her from behind the sofa, holding a small pistol to her head. "It's over, Volkov!" he shrieked, his eyes wide with panic. "Drop it, or she dies!" Alessio froze, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury. He slowly lowered his weapon. But Annalise knew, with a chilling certainty, that Bellini would kill them both anyway. Without thinking, she stomped her heel down hard on Bellini's instep. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Alessio needed. 3 shots, fired with blinding speed, echoed through the room. Bellini crumpled to the floor, his life extinguishing before he even hit the ground. Silence fell, a heavy, deafening shroud over the carnage. The only sound was their own ragged breathing. They were the only ones left standing, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the bodies of their enemies. In the moments that followed, the world came rushing back in. The scent of blood, the wail of distant sirens. Alessio was at her side in an instant, his hands checking her for injuries, his eyes wild with the last vestiges of adrenaline. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. She shook her head, her body trembling. "Your shoulder." "It's nothing," he dismissed, but his face was pale. Before either could speak again, his men stormed the room, their efficiency a cold, terrifying thing to behold. They moved with a chilling purpose, checking the bodies, securing the floor, erasing their presence. As they worked, Alessio got on the phone, his voice once again the calm, lethal command of the Don. He was giving orders, restructuring his empire, cutting out the cancer of Valerio's betrayal. But something was different. As his men, these hardened killers, moved past Annalise, they nodded their heads, their eyes holding a new, profound respect. She was no longer a captive, a weakness, or a pet. They had all heard the live stream. They had seen her on the battlefield. She had unmasked the traitor. She had saved their Dawn. In their world of blood and honor, she had earned her place. After the bodies were gone and the shattered glass swept away, as the sun began to cast its first pale light over the city, Alessio finally finished his calls. He walked over to her, the exhaustion and pain finally showing on his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, amidst the quiet wreckage of their war. He gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dust from her cheek. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. The same words she had once whispered to a lonely man at a gala. The question was a bridge across the chasm of violence and fear that had separated them, a final, quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived. A tear she didn't know she was holding finally fell. "Yes," she whispered back. "I am now."
In the weeks that followed, the blood was washed away from the marble floors, but the city held its breath, sensing a shift in the tectonic plates of the underworld. The Volkov Empire was stronger, more unified, more feared than ever before. Bellini was gone. The traitor, Valerio, was a ghost whispered about in cautionary tales. That night, Alessio stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights a kingdom at his feet. But he was not alone. Annalise stood beside him, not behind him, a warm, solid presence in the cool night air. She was dressed in a simple, elegant gown, but she wore an aura of quiet power that was more commanding than any jewel. She was the queen to his king, a truth the entire city was beginning to understand. "My capos are calling you Donna Volkov," he said, not looking at her, his voice a low rumble. "The Lady of the Wolves. They say you have the eyes of a dove, but the instincts of a serpent." She was silent for a moment. Then, "And what do you say?" He finally turned to face her. Under his possessive gaze, which was now tempered with a deep, profound tenderness, he saw the woman who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. He saw the woman who had seen the monster inside him and had not run away. He saw the woman who had passed a test he didn't even know he was still administering. Because of that, he knew he would never be alone again. He pulled her close, his wounded shoulder a dull ache, a permanent reminder of their victory. He held her, as if she were the anchor of his entire world. "I say," he murmured, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not about possession or passion, but about a deep and final belonging, "that they are right." He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, the lights of their empire glittering below. "You passed the test, Annalise." She smiled, a genuine, radiant thing that outshone the entire city. "So did you."